Source criticism was one of the earlier, more consistent modes of trying to approach the text. So before the formal working of source criticism with guys like Wellhausen and Devet and others, there were questions about biblical origins, and it became more crystallized, especially approaching the Pentateuch, in what became known as literary criticism early on, later termed source criticism out of confusion with what we now call literary criticism, which is more like narrative focused, plot, characterization, and things like that. So source criticism came on the scene, and they said, now, given that the portrait of how the Bible came into being as it presents itself is not the case, we now need to see how the various sources that we might see in the Bible came into being. So source criticism begins with the theory that the Bible was originally completely disparate sources, and then it was brought together as an amalgamation of those various sources. And so, for example, Pauline Viviano, in an article she wrote on source criticism, defines it like this. It says that biblical writers incorporated, rewrote, and reinterpreted tradition material, whether they say so or not, to produce their versions of Israel's past. And now the goal of the source critic is to retrace this process by isolating each redactional layer, thus revealing the sources that have come together to form the text as we now have it. Or another definition by John Barton, that he says literary criticism, using the old way of referencing it, is a method used in handling texts that have been produced by amalgamating other older texts. And I think the image that Barton uses there of amalgamation is amalgamation of other text is a pretty good image of what goes on, because if you're thinking about using sources, I think we think of it in a very different way than how the critical scholars are
Right.
wanting to talk about sources.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm teaching my class and I'm giving them assignment to write a paper, I might say something, you have to use a minimum of 15 sources in this paper. What I mean by that is you need to go out, you need to do research, you need to reference other people's thought. If you're getting a thought from someone, you need to show where you're getting it from, maybe engage critically some other people's thought, so on and so forth. And that'll be brought into a paper by means of footnotes, quotations, and things like this. That is not what the critical scholars mean by sources. What critical scholars mean by sources would be more akin to something like if I were to go and write a book. If in order for me to write this book, what I did is I gathered together 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8 different books on the same topic that disagreed with one another. And then I copy and pasted portions of those books into different parts of my own book, and then tried to iron it out with some other additions of my own. So it's much more like, to speak of it anachronistically, a copy and paste job. And a bad one at that for source criticism. So it's taking disparate textual sources and even contradictory textual sources, taking portions of them out and then collecting it as a different work altogether.
Yeah.
So thinking, for example, of Isaiah, we're talking about Isaiah 1, 2, and 3 in the previous episode. Those are kind of the 3 larger collections of these disparate sources that were later redactionally brought together. Or in the Pentateuch, the main 4 are the Yahweh source, Elohim source, Deuteronomic source, and priestly source. 4 different sources that all disagree with one another on various levels, then brought together by someone later on to form the Pentateuch as we have it today. So it's not like Isaiah, or what they're talking about is not like Isaiah or Moses or someone else using a source earlier than them. It's the book as a whole comes together as disparate sources. These disparate texts is what they'll call them, or source texts, that are then inorganically brought together.
That "ur" comes from a German word of like primitive or primal or before.
Right. Or early.
Yeah. Early. Yeah. So just to put it another way, bring out my inner Gaffin. For folks that may have heard about JEDP, what that is. Well, that's a source critical theory of the origins of the Pentateuch. And so they'll look at the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, and they'll notice that there might be differences. And they notice that some portions of it, when they refer to God, they might say the covenantal name Yahweh. Other portions, they might say Elohim, which is a more generic name for God. It still, in the Bible, refers to the one true and living God, but it's not the specific covenantal name God revealed. It's the difference between saying, the Lord with capital letters and God. And so they'll look at and see those differences, and they'll notice some trends that this portion seems to only use Elohim. This portion tends to use Yahweh. Therefore, if it's all lumped together, this one portion must have come from a different source, and somebody stitched these together and didn't iron out the differences that well, so we can see the seams of where it was stitched together, and we're going to try to pull it apart, right? Yeah, I mean, that's a real basic idea of kind of what's going on.
A poorly sewn quilt, basically.
Yeah, a poorly sewn quilt. The premise is that the biblical books, as we have them, especially applied to the Pentateuch and Isaiah, are unreadable in their present form. Right? We can't read them as modern readers in the present form, which is a great irony of source criticism. We can talk about that more here in just a minute.
I don't know, Jeff. I read it. I read it this year. Did you read it?
Yeah. So, well, I guess we can go to it now. The great irony of source criticism is that it divides up the biblical books into these disparate sources, but when you go and look at them, it's actually less readable than how the Pentateuch actually is. And so one of, I think, the critical points against the critical scholars is that they seek to find a book or a source that is more in tune with our modern sensibilities. And when they do so, they actually make something that is more unreadable than before. So in their task to find something quote unquote readable, they make it less readable than how it was in its original form. And so I was telling my class the other day, a lot of the divisions that they'll articulate between texts can be easily solved by merely paying attention to literary development and literary features within the text. Like, for example, one of the tools that source criticism will use to divide up a text is duplications. So if something is repeated in a narrative, they would say, you don't repeat yourself. That's a bad way of writing. That has to come from 2 different sources talking about the same event later brought together. For one example of that is Genesis chapter 6 and the flood narrative in verses 3-5. There is an initial declaration of the wickedness of man and the Lord coming and therefore going to bring this flood and judge wicked humanity. And then a very similar aspect of that is repeated in verses 9-13 immediately following that. So these scholars look at that and say duplication, repetition, different sources. And so they'll divide out the sources in that way. However, just paying attention to the narrative, verses 3-5 is kind of like a heading to the whole flood narrative there in Genesis chapters 6-9. And then as the narrative progresses, the focus in verses 9-13 is on this particular person, this particular character in that narrative, which is Noah. So yes, there are repetitive elements, but that repetition is for the sake of expansion, and we're gaining more information, especially pertaining to this righteous one, Noah, who's going to be redeemed through this flood, through the tri-level ark, and brought to safety on the other side. And so, many of the difficulties that they promote, that they speak of, are actually solved within the narrative itself. And it's actually makes it more readable, because if you divest the narrative from those additional elements, all of a sudden you have characters that are introduced inorganically. It becomes a much more difficult read than before. Or even the differences between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 can be seen in the same way. It's not, completely disparate creation accounts. It's just honing in or zooming in on a particular aspect of the one creation account in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2.